A soldier's dying wish was simple, to say goodbye to his loyal canine. But what the dog did, when he approached the coffin, left the entire ceremony in stunned silence. He stood at attention, staring at the flag-draped casket like it was his commanding officer one last time. But it wasn't a person inside. It was his dog, his best friend, his partner. And as the military funeral began, something happened that stopped everyone in their tracks. The sun hung low over Arlington National Cemetery, painting the sky with strokes of amber and crimson. Rows of white headstones stretched into the distance like silent soldiers. There was not a single sound except for the soft rustle of the flag in the wind. Until the bagpipes began, Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan stood tall in full uniform, but his eyes were locked onto the casket in front of him. Inside it lay Coda, a Belgian Malinois who had served beside him for 6 years across multiple deployments. Coda wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier, a hero, and Michael's only family left. As the chaplain began to speak, recounting Coda's bravery in war zones, how he sniffed out explosives, saved entire platoons, even took a bullet for Michael once, the soldier's hands clenched tighter, his jaw locked. But his eyes, they never left the casket. Sitting quietly beside the casket, wearing a small black vest, was a younger Malinois named Scout, Coda's protege, the one who had watched everything from the sidelines, trained under the Great War Dog, and now sat in eerie silence, as if he too understood what today meant. But this story didn't start here. Not in the cemetery, not with a flag or a funeral. It started months earlier, in the dusty heat of Kandahar. Back then, Coda had been slowing down. His once snappy movements had grown more deliberate. Michael had noticed the limp that came after every mission, the way Coda took longer to lie down, how his breathing changed when he slept. But Coda never complained. He never disobeyed a single order. Not once. During what was supposed to be their final deployment together, Coda did something no one expected. There was a mission, a high-risk recon near a known insurgent compound. The terrain was unstable, the intel shaky, and the bomb threat very real. They were clearing a pathway for an incoming convoy when Coda suddenly stopped in his tracks, ears up, nose flaring. Michael barely had time to react before Coda bolted ahead. "Wait, Coda, heel," Michael had shouted, but the dog ignored him. He surged forward, digging into the earth with his paws, and then an explosio. The shockwave hit Michael like a freight train. He remembered dirt in his mouth, a ringing in his ears, and then silence. When he came to, he was in the field hospital. His leg was bandaged. A concussion had blurred his memory, but the first thing he asked was, "Where's Coda?" The answer was worse than any wound. Coda had shielded the blast. His body had absorbed most of it. The explosion that should have killed Michael didn't, because Coda had made a choice. He lived for 2 more days. Michael never left his side. They flew back to Germany together, then to the States. And when the time came, Michael held his head as the vet gave the final injection. He didn't cry. But now, at the funeral, as the honor guard folded the American flag that had been draped over Coda's casket and handed it to Michael, something broke. Still, he didn't shed a tear. He knelt down beside the casket and whispered something no one else could hear. "Stand down. Soldier, you're home now." That's when Scout, the young Malinois, stood up. He walked slowly to the casket. No command was given, no cue. But he sat beside it, raised his paw, and gently tapped the wooden lid. Then he lay down beside it, resting his head as if on guard or mourning. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. A general lowered his head. One of the soldiers couldn't stop the tears from falling. Michael's eyes met Scout's, and in that moment, he knew. The mission wasn't over, but Coda's part in it was. As the final notes of taps echoed through the air, Michael stood and saluted, not just for the flag, not just for the military, but for a dog who had been more than anyone expected, and who had given everything without ever saying a word. What no one else knew, though, was that this funeral was just the beginning, because later that same night, Michael received a message that would unravel everything he thought he knew about Coda's final mission, and it would send him down a path no one could have foreseen. The sun had barely begun to rise when Sergeant David Cole found himself standing alone, near the modest wooden structure where Max had spent his retirement years. The morning air carried a quiet stillness, the kind that only came with grief. Max had passed in his sleep 2 nights ago. No whimper, no struggle, just silence, but his absence screamed louder than any siren. David reached for the weathered leather collar still hanging on a rusty nail by the door. His fingers lingered on it longer than expected. He had worn his uniform to this small space not because it was protocol, but because it felt like the only way to honor his partner, his best friend, his brother in battle. Max wasn't just a dog. He was the one who had pulled David from the wreckage of an IED blast. He was the one who sensed the ambush moments before it unfolded, the one who'd refused to leave David's side, teeth bared and eyes locked on threats even when bullets flew. Max had scars, but never complaints. The base had arranged for a ceremony unlike any other. Max's life wasn't just being acknowledged, it was being remembered as that of a hero. As soldiers began to gather near the open field where the memorial would be held, there was a reverent silence that blanketed the area, the kind you felt in your bones. A wooden casket lay at the front, draped in the American flag. Max's leash had been coiled beside it, almost like he was ready to be walked one last time. The photos placed around the space told stories louder than words could. Max sniffing out explosives, Max beside wounded soldiers, Max sitting stoically during roll call, Max letting kids at the base climb all over him with the patience of a saint. David stepped forward. He looked out at the crowd, soldiers, medics, trainers, even the families who had come to know Max over the years. His voice cracked as he began. I met Max during one of the darkest years of my life. I had just come back from a tour that nearly broke me. But then this dog, this 4-legged soldier, looked at me like I was worth saving. A murmur rippled through the audience, the kind only shared by those who had seen too much and said too little. Everyone here knew what it meant to love and lose a canine partner. The bond was sacred, unspoken, unbreakable. I've watched him pull men from burning Humvees, David continued. I've seen him walk into compounds before any of us dared to, and he did it without question. Every time. Just then, a small hand went up from the front row. A boy, no more than 10, stood beside his mother in a military widow's dress. David nodded, eyes soft. The boy stepped forward. Sir, I remember Max. When my dad didn't come home, Max sat with me on the steps. He didn't leave. He didn't bark. He just stayed there and looked at me. A long pause followed. The boy's words hit David like a punch to the gut. He thought of all the families who had sent their loved ones off to war, only to have them return in caskets. But this boy, he wasn't just remembering a dog. He was remembering a moment when he wasn't alone. A moment when Max had been there for him just like he had been there for so many others. David stepped down and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Max was more than just a dog. He was family. He was there for all of us, no matter what. He saved us. He loved us. And today, we remember him. As the boy stepped back, the silence hung thick in the air. But then the wind began to pick up, rustling the flags draped across the stage. The sound of a bugle playing taps echoed through the space, and the veterans standing near the casket saluted with tears in their eyes. A row of retired K-9 South, all with their own handlers, stepped forward and sat silently beside the casket. They, too, understood the weight of this moment. These dogs weren't just pets. They were warriors. But the moment wasn't over. A figure in the back of the crowd moved forward, his steps deliberate, and a photo in his hand. The crowd parted, recognizing him immediately. He was a former soldier who had served with David and Max during their tours in Iraq. He was known for being tough, unflappable, but his face was drawn with sorrow. David's heart skipped a beat as the soldier approached the front, his eyes locked on the casket. This dog, the soldier said in a voice thick with emotion, he saved my life. In Fallujah, we were pinned down by enemy fire, and I was about to lose my leg. But Max, he ran in, pulled me out, and didn't stop until he knew I was safe. I never got the chance to thank him, but I'm here to do that now. David's eyes blurred with tears. He stepped forward and embraced the soldier. No words were needed. The weight of their shared history, Their shared grief was enough. The soldier placed the photo on top of Max's casket, a photo of Max, younger, standing proudly beside their unit in combat gear. The soldier's hand lingered for a moment before he stepped back. The ceremony ended. But the grief didn't leave. Max's spirit lingered in the air, heavy yet comforting. His legacy was more than just his service. It was in the hearts of every person who had known him. The following days were filled with tributes, letters, and messages. People who had never met Max felt the impact of his sacrifice. And back at the base, David spent each day by the glass case where Max's collar and photo now resided. Every time he walked past, he'd pause for a moment of quiet reflection. The base would never forget Max. His name would be passed down through the ranks, from one soldier to the next, just as the memory of his courage and loyalty would live on forever. And every morning, without fail, Sergeant Cole would stand in front of the glass case, place a hand on Max's collar, and whisper softly, "You did good, boy," because even in death, Max continued to serve, and that was the greatest tribute of all. The days following the ceremony were quiet. The base, which had once been filled with the constant hum of activity, felt empty. The absence of Max was like a shadow over the soldiers who had once worked alongside him. David found himself walking the familiar paths they used to tread together, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. Max had always been more than just a dog. He had been the embodiment of loyalty, of strength, of unwavering determination. There wasn't a single mission, a single moment, where Max hadn't given everything for his team. And now, in his absence, David could feel that void deeper than he had anticipated. One particular evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David found himself on the old, weathered bench where Max would sit after every long shift. It was the same bench where they had shared countless hours together, waiting for the next assignment. The bench seemed smaller without him, quieter. David ran his fingers over the rough wood, his mind replaying memories of their time together. He thought about the last mission they'd completed together. It had been dangerous, nothing out of the ordinary for David and his team. But Max had been the one to alert them to a hidden IED that would have taken out the entire squad. He closed his eyes, remembering the sound of Max's bark when he had first sniffed out the device. The way his ears had perked up, his tail rigid and straight. Max had stood his ground, even as enemy fire rained down around them. His focus had never wavered. It was like he knew his role, and nothing would stop him from fulfilling it. David had gotten to him just in time, pulling him to safety before the bomb detonated. That's what Max had done. He had saved lives over and over again. He had been the one to risk it all, without hesitatio. And now, the world felt different without him. David sighed and glanced at the photo on the bench, one of the many that had been left behind. In memory of Max, this one was of the two of them, covered in dust and sweat, but standing tall after another successful missio. David had always hated how the camera caught him mid-laugh. His face contorted in a way that made him look far younger than he felt. But Max looked proud. His eyes were alert, his posture perfect. It was the last photo they'd taken before the long deployment ended. A soft noise interrupted David's reverie, a faint rustle in the bushes. His military instincts kicked in immediately, and his hand moved toward his sidearm. He stood up, his eyes scanning the darkening area. But when his eyes landed on the source of the noise, he froze. It was another dog, smaller, with the unmistakable markings of a K9 unit. The dog trotted toward him, sniffing the ground as it came closer. David knelt, his heart pounding as he recognized the dog's uniform. "Hey there, boy," David said softly, extending a hand. The dog hesitated for a moment before leaning into his touch, as if it knew him. The leash, which hung loosely from its collar, swayed in the cool evening breeze. David couldn't help but smile, despite the overwhelming sadness that had consumed him. It had been days since Max had passed, but seeing this new dog, so similar to his late partner, stirred something deep inside of him. It was as if the spirit of Max still lingered in the air, reminding him that the work wasn't over. The dog sat at his feet, looking up at him expectantly. David's smile faded as he thought about what it would mean to work with another K9. Could he ever replace Max? Could he ever trust another dog to be his partner in the same way? The thought was painful, but as the dog sat there, watching him with those knowing eyes, David realized something. Max had never expected to be replaced. Max had always known that his job was to serve and protect, no matter the circumstances. And that's what this new dog would do. He wasn't meant to replace Max, he was meant to carry on his legacy. David stood up, taking the leash in his hand. "Let's get you some water, huh?" he said quietly, as if the dog could understand him. The dog wagged its tail and followed David as he walked toward the base's supply room. As David entered the building, a voice called out to him. It was Sergeant Harris, the K9 unit trainer. He had been with the team longer than anyone else and had seen countless dogs come and go. "David," Harris said, his voice a little more subdued than usual. "You all right?" David nodded, though he didn't feel all right. He wasn't sure he ever would be again. He started, but the words didn't come easily. "I keep expecting Max to be here, you know. Like he'll walk through that door any second, ready to go on the next mission. But he's not, and I don't know how to do this without him." Harris placed a hand on David's shoulder. "You don't do it without him," he said quietly. "You do it with the memory of him. And you keep going, for Max, for every life he saved, for every mission he completed. You do it because that's what he would have wanted." David swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He thought about the mission where Max had saved his life, about all the times Max had put his life on the line for the team. "I'll try," he said softly. Harris nodded. Double quotes good. "You've got this." David turned back to the dog, who was now sitting at his feet, waiting patiently for his next move. "All right," David muttered, his voice more determined than before. "Let's go get you trained." The next few days passed in a blur. David worked tirelessly with the new K9, teaching it the same skills he had once taught Max. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And in every moment, David could feel Max's spirit guiding him, pushing him to move forward. Max had given his all for this mission, and now it was David's turn to honor that legacy. By the time the dog had passed its first training course, David had started to find peace. The pain of losing Max would never go away, but he had come to understand that he didn't have to forget him. In order to move on, he could carry Max's memory with him into every mission, into every new partnership. And so, David Cole and his new partner, a small but fierce K9, stood at the front of the training yard, ready for whatever came next. They didn't need to replace Max, they just needed to keep moving forward together. David and his new K9 partner had come a long way. It had been months since they first began training together, and every day, the bond between them grew stronger. The dog, whose name was Titan, had proven to be a worthy successor to Max in ways David hadn't expected. Titan was quick, agile, and incredibly intelligent. He reminded David of Max in many ways, but there was one thing that still lingered in the back of his mind. Titan wasn't Max. No matter how well he performed, no matter how many missions they completed, Titan could never fill the void left by his beloved K9. But that didn't mean he wasn't a valuable partner. Titan had a spirit of his own, one that could never be replaced. David stood at the entrance of the training facility, watching as Titan paced back and forth, his leash slack in David's hand. It was another day of drills, and Titan had been showing exceptional progress. But David was still stuck on the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't Titan's fault he was doing everything right. It was David who needed to adjust. He couldn't keep comparing Titan to Max. Max was gone, and Titan deserved a chance to carve his own legacy. As they began their training session, David felt a sense of resolve wash over him. He would stop looking back. He would stop measuring Titan against a ghost. This was their time, and it was time to move forward. "All right, Titan," David said, his voice steady. "Let's show them what we've got." The dog barked in response, its ears perked and its tail wagging. The first exercise was simple, tracking a scent trail. The scent was faint, just enough to test Titan's abilities. David watched as Titan sniffed the air, his nose low to the ground. The dog was in his element, his focus intense, his movements precise. It didn't take long before Titan found the scent, and within moments, he was sprinting ahead. Following the trail with an instinct that seemed to come from within, David couldn't help but smile. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of pride that wasn't rooted in the past. Titan wasn't Max, but he was his own incredible dog. And together, they were an unstoppable team. After the training session, David sat on a bench, watching Titan drink water. He was exhausted, but content. This was what he had been missing, the sense of partnership, the sense of purpose. As he watched Titan, his mind wandered to the mission ahead. They had been selected for a high-risk Operation 1 that would take them deep into enemy territory. David had done this kind of thing countless times with Max, but this would be different. This time, it was Titan who would have his back. That night, David sat alone in his room, the weight of the mission heavy on his shoulders. He didn't fear the danger. He had been in more life-threatening situations than he could count. What worried him was the idea of failing Titan. He had been given a second chance, but it wasn't just about surviving, it was about honoring the legacy of his fallen friend. If they were going into that mission, David knew they had to do it for Max. Max had trained him, had saved his life more times than David could remember. It was time to prove that Max's sacrifice wasn't in vain. The morning of the mission arrived, and David found himself standing in front of the team, ready to brief them on what lay ahead. Titan stood beside him, his posture proud and alert. "This mission is dangerous," David said, his voice calm but resolute. "We don't know what we'll face, but we know this: we have each other, and we will get through this together. Titan has been training for this, and I trust him with my life. Let's make sure we all make it home." The team nodded, their expressions serious. They knew the stakes were high, but there was something else in David's voice, something that made them all believe in him and in Titan. It was the quiet confidence that came from years of experience, and it was something that no amount of fear could shake. The mission began as planned. The team moved swiftly through the dense forest, their movements calculated and precise. Titan moved with them, his nose to the ground, alert to every sound, every smell. There was no hesitation in his steps. He was focused, driven. He had been through this kind of mission before, and he knew exactly what to do. But as the hours passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. They hadn't encountered any resistance, but the silence was unsettling. David's instincts were on high alert. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, a gunshot. The sound was deafening, followed by the screeching of metal. David's heart raced. It was an ambush move. David shouted, pulling his team into formation. Titan was already on the move, his sharp instincts guiding him through the chaos. The team split up, taking cover behind trees and rocks. The gunfire continued, the crack of rifles and the whoosh of grenades cutting through the night air. David's mind raced as he scanned the area. He could hear Titan's bark in the distance, guiding them toward safety. The dog was doing exactly what he had been trained to do, leading the way, warning of danger before it could strike. But in the distance, David saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure moving swiftly toward their position. It was a sniper. Without thinking, David moved into action. "Titan, with me," he shouted, his voice sharp. Titan responded immediately, running alongside David as they moved toward the threat. The sniper hadn't noticed them yet, but David knew they didn't have much time. As they closed the distance, David raised his weapon, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been in situations like this before, but never with so much at stake. He had to protect his team, and he had to protect Titan. With a single motion, David took the shot, neutralizing the threat. The sniper collapsed to the ground, and the forest fell silent once more. David breathed a sigh of relief, his body still tense. Titan sat beside him, looking up at him with those familiar eyes. The dog's work was far from over, but for a moment, David allowed himself to relax. "We made it," David muttered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Titan nuzzled his hand, a silent affirmation. David had proven something that day, not just to his team, but to himself. He had made peace with the past, and he had learned to trust again. Titan might not have been Max, but he had earned his place beside David. Together, they had faced the darkness and come out victorious. As they made their way back to base, David knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. There would be more missions, more challenges, but they would face them together. And that was all that mattered.